Devesh is, well, I can't use the phrase old friend, but someone who writings, at least I have read with great interest over a fair amount of time, mainly in the areas of higher education, which all of us are intimately interested in, but also his very fascinating work on the Indian diaspora. It's unusual for people to both make large points and to be so empirically grounded and give us huge amounts of data with supporting evidence so that we can question not just the large story, but we can question every small part. And that, I think, is an unusual style of writing on large public issues, which I hope more of us emulate. With that, let me just invite Devesh to start the lecture.
Thank you, Harsh, for a very generous sort of introduction, and thank you all for being here. So, the outline of my talk, but I want to just give you a little bit background about the performance of the Indian state, and it should not be surprising that it's going to be a mixed sort of record. Just give you a sense that when we think about the state, state has many constituent parts, and the performance of the Indian state varies across its subnational units. I'll take you through the sort of more conventional explanations of what might explain this performance. What I want to then emphasize is perhaps something, at least I think, we have neglected. We think always of more grand theories and big picture things. And I just want to emphasize that we have, I think, very much neglected factors. When we think of the state, we think of it as institutions, but we don't think of the state as also the organizational manifestation of the state. And the organizations of the state are, for the most part, a sort of black box. And it's these intra-organizational factors which I argue we have neglected. And that is an important, though by no means the sole reason that explains much of the malaise. And then I'll end with a small point, because I very much feel that the key challenge that India faces down the line is essentially the state of the Indian state. So, many of us have seen this before, which is the puzzle of the Indian state, right? That it varies greatly. It can manage some complex tasks, conducting elections, sending a mission to Mars, doing censuses, organizing the Kumbh Mela, really pretty well. But it fails at the simple ones, especially the very, very basics, what every state should be doing, which is primary education, health, water, sanitation. At the same time, it has been pretty politically effective in managing one of the world's largest armed forces. But it has been pretty ineffective in managing public service bureaucracies. I think it's fair to say that the challenge facing the state when when India became independent was really, the challenges were very, very steep. And I think, to be fair to the Indian state, it was dealt with a poor hand of cards, in a sense, right? And clearly one of its biggest successes has been that it has managed to sort of meander along within a reasonable democratic framework, right? So the usual thing in political theory is that, look, you need all these prerequisites to remain a democracy, but India failed in sort of all of them, right? It was not homogeneous, it was not urban, it was not very literate, it was very poor, and it had, this is a quote from Barrington Moore, who had said, "No bourgeoisie, no democracy." And of course, India. So you find in almost all of these that there's also the thing that a first past the post electoral system is seen as inherently unstable in societies with multiple cleavages, and India has managed that, also reasonably okay. And then there's also this paradox of generally a political centrism against a backdrop of a polity, which has been susceptible to political extremism, right? So in virtually every cross-national study, you know, going back 30 years, you always find that India is the outlier. And they come up with all sorts of structural explanations, and they say, but there is India, right? And that, I think, is a sense of an accomplishment of the Indian state, which I think should very strongly be acknowledged. And it's also been somewhat successful on so-called socio-economic indicators, right? And this sort of shows that at the time of independence, just how far back we were, right? Whether it's literacy, life expectancy, and in all of these, you see considerable change. But of course, as I'll show you, it's always a question of, is the glass half full or is it half sort of empty? So, you know, you can look at, you know, data on child mortality. So all of these, if you look at over long periods of time, you'll see that there have been undoubtedly sort of improvements. You look at polio, another scourge of India, that too has been eradicated. So there have been been a range of successes. And if you look at standard central schemes, I have just picked two schemes, which is the Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan and the Kasturba scheme. And so you take a standard scheme, right? So you control for the type of scheme and the ability of states to even spend the money. Now this is sort of important because we think all politicians like to spend, right? I mean, no one says that politicians are really frugal, would not like to spend. They have a politically sort of incentive, and they may even have a rent-seeking sort of incentive to spend. But you see, you have huge, again, like variation in the capacity to spend, right? It is amazing, as I've looked across a range of central schemes, how many states actually send back or are unable to spend at the end of the year on a host of schemes the amount of money. And even when you control for the fact that a centrally sponsored scheme might penalize a state which is ruled by the opposition party, that really we find does not explain these outcomes. The ability to spend also matters, that you have a set of bureaucrats who are able to do all the paperwork, all of that which is required, and some states simply lack those capabilities. So the usual villains is a list of like a Bollywood film. You need a villain. I'll come to the heroes like later on. So one is the contemporary debate, which you see a lot. It must be this thing called neoliberalism, globalization. It occurs as a villain quite regularly. Then, depending on your point of view, the villain is in the past. It's the Nehruvian state, or it's planning that it doesn't. Actually, I think our problem was not planning, but the lack of planning. We never did enough planning in some ways. If you look at any of our cities and towns, it's very obvious actually that we did planning only of a certain type at a certain level. But for the most part, what India is marked by is a complete absence of so planning, especially at the micro level, as opposed to the grand macro level. For some, you go further back in time, and that you blame the British. For some, you go even further back in time, you blame the Islamic rule. And for some, there was some golden age, but they say, aha, but it's the Manusmriti, it lays down the caste system, and that's the source of our problems. So by and large, we want to have our villains to be outside. They are passed either in time or in space. In the more sort of academic literature, you see these type of phrases, that it is the particular features of Indian democracy. So it's politician-voter linkages, what we call client relationships, or the politician-business linkages, which we call patronage, the weak institutions, captured by elites, our social heterogeneity, which makes a lot of these things possible, some historical or institutional factors. There's a credibility gap between voters and politicians, so voters don't really trust for politicians to deliver. And some say it's because the state is unwilling or unable to spend enough money, and there's incentive argued this a lot. Some says that it's because of lack of information, so the principal, which is the voter, cannot monitor the agent, who is the politician or the bureaucrat. Then it's a question of poetic design. So these are all a range of explanations which you standard-wise see. And as with this, these are good studies, and all of them have some merit, depending on the type and scope of the study. Now, one thing I think we should realize is that the Indian state has always been weak, right? You see all these ways in which the state has been described. A soft state, a my-baap state, a patronage state, a flailing state, a bypass state, which always tries to bypass what the problem is, a jugaad state, a Sisyphean state. It's also now an everyday state. It matters to most people's lives on an everyday basis to some degree or form, which is why the state does and will matter. So another set of explanations is that, look, this is the price of democracy. And one price of the democracy which we face is you have elections. Elections cost money. The money has to be raised from somewhere. And so you have a far greater population now, so you need more per voter. The party system has fragmented. There's more electoral competition. The political parties weaker. There's little internal funding. You need to raise it from outside. You have more and more local elections, so you need even more money, for financing local and panchayats for elections. And that with identity politics, you get adverse candidate selection, right? So this is from the work of Sir Milan Devesh. This is the number of parties in national elections. You see a massive increase over time, but of course, these parties are mainly small, so we use a term called effective, number of parties. And that too, rapidly changed until the last general elections. And you see a fairly similar pattern at the state level as well, right? We also know that there is a major criminalization of politics. Politicians used to use criminals. So this also is now widely documented in a range of sort of things that have come out over the past decade. And so this whole idea of money and muscle is something that is intrinsically linked to the nature of electoral politics in India. Now, this is a sort of different type of the consequences of electoral politics. So one of the things you often hear is that India does not spend enough. Right? Government spending is small or not enough, it should be. Now this is a graph, this is work from Arvind Subramaniam, who is the CA now. And what he looked at is, given India's current level of income, when other countries were at India's level of income, right? Given India's current level of government spending, which is now about 1/4 of GDP, what was the level of income other countries had when they were spending at that level? And you can see that most of the other countries, their incomes, take South Korea. It came to that level of spending when its per capita income was, $20,000. You take most countries of what are now OECD countries, the classic welfare states. All of them, their level of government spending was much lower than what India has now. For that level of per capita income. Now, part of this is, of course, is being driven by electoral politics. So you see how, as elections become more and more competitive, spending, this is the government spending as a share of GDP, it shows a virtual linear increase over time. And of course, the flip side is you get deficits are going exactly the opposite way. And that's, again, not surprising because, as I showed you earlier, your capacity to tax has not increased with time. Your capacity to spend, or your willingness to spend, has increased much more over time. And that's the consequence of this. So what I want to now focus in is the thing which I think we tend to neglect about our public institutions. And we think of public institutions, and this is, I think, one of the big problems of the institutional turn in the social sciences, which we think of institutions only as rules of the game. But the idea of institutions as organizations, how do they work from inside? What are the intra-organizational forces, factors that shape them? That is something we tend to usually, I think, neglect. So in the central role of internal factors, what I want, these are some that I want to, how we recruit, how do we, how do we motivate people after they're recruited? What are the determinants of organizational effectiveness? Now, what are some of the pathologies of the Indian state, right? So one is what I think is the inordinate attention we have paid to social representation. Now, I think there is widespread consensus that social representation is absolutely fundamental to get a greater legitimacy of the state. And legitimacy itself is fundamental for a state to be effective. So I think that causal chain is, by and large, very much agreed on. But I think what was a necessary means essentially became the end. In thinking about the legitimacy and effectiveness of the state, we thought that reservation is enough. So what should have been a starting point, I think regrettably became an end point. So what we've tended to do has been a preference for programs and schemes over policies. Most of these programs fundamentally are the reach far exceeds the grasp. I think one of the worst long-term cognitive impacts of the planning regime was there's been a huge, always distrust of the local, and often for good reasons. I'm not saying that's not been, and very skeptical of local capacity. Now, both of these factors over time became a self-reinforcing. Because the more you distrust, the more you're skeptical, the more these capabilities will never be built up. And so you are condemned to repeat like where you started. Our programs, we love very intricate, design. When I look at all the rights that we pass, it is incredible what people in Delhi can think of in the complexity of design of projects and programs. Now, how does, given all this, I think the problem is compounded by the instruments that the state wants to use. So one is, we love laws and legislation. We think that if we pass them, we have already achieved half the goal. We love bans. If you don't like anything, you ban it. From Uber to films to whatever you don't like, so we think it's effective. De facto, because we think that the executive branch has been failing, de facto we are transferring more and more of executive branch functions to the judiciary, with I think consequences that can be even more troubling. And the thing that I find very mysterious is that we really love homogeneous solutions for a very heterogeneous countries. If you think of the design of the NREGS and when the new government came, there were a whole range of questions because it said it wants to change the ratio of labor to material costs. Now, and there was a big uproar among some people that this is anti-labor, all of that. Now, it might be anti-labor, but it is also the case that there is no reason to believe that the exact ratio of labor to capital in a program like NREGS should be identical in a rich state like Kerala compared to a poor state like Assam. There is nothing in economic theory. There is nothing in the effectiveness of implementation. There is only the sense that people in Delhi know what the exact formula ought to be, and that people at the local level are either devious or corrupt or simply will not do the right thing. But only people in Delhi know what is the right thing. And you simply will not empower and allow, at least give them a range of between 30 or 50%, so that they can actually learn for themselves what might work in their own area.